Behind the razor wire and gray stone walls of Folsom Prison lies more than a century of brutality, redemption, and rebellion. Built in 1880, this fortress has witnessed electric lights before the streets of America had them, and death before mercy was ever an option. From the echo of execution chambers to riots that shook the state, Folsom's story is carved in blood, innovation, and survival. This isn't just a prison, it's the beating heart of California's darkest history. When Folsom Prison first opened its iron gates on July 26, 1880, California was a land still wrestling with its identity. The gold rush had long faded, leaving behind not just riches but chaos, drifters, outlaws, gamblers, and men hardened by greed and survival. The state needed a place to contain its most dangerous souls, and so, on the banks of the American River, near the small town of Folsom, a fortress began to rise, built not of mercy but of granite and resolve. Folsom was the second oldest prison in California, standing in the shadow of its infamous predecessor, San Quentin. But unlike San Quentin, which began as a makeshift facility on a ship, Folsom was designed to be something far more permanent, a true fortress of discipline. Every stone, every iron bar was meant to remind inmates that once you entered, freedom wasn't just a distant dream, it was almost an impossibility. The prison's early design reflected both ambition and fear. Towering granite walls, quarried by the very men they were meant to contain, surrounded the compound. Inside, narrow cells were stacked in tiers, built with no comfort and little light. It was here that inmates labored endlessly under the hot California sun, breaking rocks, building roads, and producing goods for the state. Folsom's philosophy was simple and brutal: hard work as redemption, or as punishment. What made Folsom different from any other prison of its time, however, was its bold step into modernity. In 1893, the prison became the first in the United States to have electric lights. This was an astonishing leap forward during an era when many American towns were still lit by kerosene lamps and candles. The electricity came from a hydroelectric power plant on the American River, one of the earliest of its kind. That light wasn't just symbolic, it was a technological milestone that positioned Folsom as a paradox, a place of innovation wrapped in darkness. But that light could never soften the grimness of life behind those walls. The early decades of Folsom were defined by harsh discipline and physical suffering. Inmates were kept under constant surveillance, their days dictated by the sound of whistles and the clang of steel doors. The guards were armed and unrelenting, enforcing order through fear rather than reform. Solitary confinement was common, and punishment was swift for anyone who dared to defy the system. The labor system at Folsom became both its signature and its curse. Prisoners were forced to work long hours in the rock quarry, cutting and hauling massive granite blocks that were later used to expand the prison itself. Some inmates compared it to being buried alive in stone. The work was backbreaking, the food meager, and medical care nearly non-existent. The smell of sweat, stone dust, and despair filled the air. Still, for many, the labor was the only thing keeping them sane, a grim routine that gave structure to the endless days. Beyond its physical cruelty, Folsom also reflected the racial and social divisions of 19th-century America. Inmates were segregated by race, class, and even the crimes they committed. Minor offenders found themselves side by side with murderers and career criminals. The overcrowding grew worse each year, and the institution that was supposed to bring order often produced more chaos. Yet the authorities continued to defend Folsom's methods, calling it a model of discipline and control. By the turn of the century, Folsom had already become a symbol, a dark icon of California's evolving justice system. For the state, it represented progress and authority. For those inside, it was a monument to lost hope. Prison records from the early 1900s described frequent escape attempts, acts of violence, and suicides. The walls that were meant to hold men safely also became a silent witness to countless deaths. One of the defining elements of Folsom's early history was its use of executions. While the prison would later become known for housing the electric chair, its earliest years relied on hangings, a grim spectacle meant to remind other inmates of their fate if they defied the rules. Over time, Folsom became one of California's primary sites for carrying out death sentences. The number, 93 executions in total, stands as a chilling reminder of how deeply death was woven into its legacy. And yet, beneath the violence and oppression, Folsom was also a mirror reflecting society's growing fascination with crime and punishment. Newspapers from the late 1800s often covered stories of life inside the prison, describing it with both horror and fascination. Visitors, including politicians and journalists, came to see the great stone fortress, that represented both the strength and the cruelty of California's justice system. Inside the prison walls, a strange culture developed. Inmates formed bonds, created rules of their own, and found small ways to express their humanity through art, letters, or quiet acts of defiance. Some even became trusted workers or guards' assistants, navigating a delicate balance between survival and submission. Others plotted escapes, dreaming of the river just beyond the walls. Few succeeded, and those who did often met their end in the wilderness. Folsom Prison's foundation wasn't just made of granite, it was built from the tension between progress and punishment. The electric lights that illuminated its corridors symbolized a new age of technology, yet those same lights cast long shadows on lives trapped within. The early Folsom years embodied a contradiction that continues to define it even today, a place that sought to civilize through confinement, to enlighten through suffering, and to discipline through control. From its earliest days, Folsom was never merely a prison, it was a statement. It told California and the world that order would be maintained no matter the cost, that the state's most dangerous men would live, work, and die behind those walls, and that even the faintest glimmer of freedom would always be out of reach. The story of Folsom's origins is not just about the creation of a building, it's about the creation of an idea, that discipline, even when cruel, was a price society was willing to pay for peace outside its walls. By the 1930s, the silence of Folsom's stone walls had been broken, replaced by the echoes of tension, violence, and rebellion. What had once been a fortress of order had turned into a battleground of power. The prison that once symbolized control now pulsed with unrest, as men inside began to push back against the very system that confined them. The decades that followed would become known as Folsom's Age of Blood, a time when survival was no longer just about enduring time, it was about staying alive. The story of this brutal era began with one of the prison's darkest moments. In 1937, Warden Clarence Larkin, a man known for his attempts to balance discipline with a touch of humanity, was stabbed to death during an escape attempt. He was attacked while inspecting a construction project inside the walls, ambushed by inmates who saw a fleeting chance at freedom. Larkin's murder shocked California and reminded the public that inside Folsom, the line between control and chaos was razor thin. His death became a grim warning to every warden that followed. Kindness could be fatal. As the decades rolled on, the prison's internal order began to crumble. The 1950s brought overcrowding, racial segregation, and a crumbling infrastructure that could no longer contain the violence brewing within. By the 1970s, Folsom had become a microcosm of America's social upheaval, a place where racial tension, gang warfare, and defiance of authority collided daily. Inside the walls, a new power structure was emerging, one that didn't answer to guards or wardens. This was the rise of the prison gangs, organizations that operated like military units, complete with hierarchies, codes of conduct, and deadly loyalty. The Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla Family, and the Aryan Brotherhood each carved out territories within the prison, transforming Folsom into a war zone. Every meal, every yard time, every shower run carried the risk of bloodshed. Alliances were fragile, betrayals were common, and revenge was inevitable. The Mexican Mafia, known as La IM, grew out of the Chicano movement, turning racial unity into an organized criminal force. The Black Guerrilla Family, born from the civil rights struggle, mixed revolutionary ideology with ruthless violence. The Aryan Brotherhood rose in response, a white supremacist gang that promised protection through brutality. Together, these factions turned Folsom into one of the most violent correctional facilities in the United States. Guards patrolled the tiers with weapons always drawn. Makeshift blades, called shanks, were hidden in walls, books, and even inside inmates' bodies. A glance, a word, or even a wrong color could trigger a deadly brawl. Some days, the sound of the yard wasn't laughter or conversation. It was the thud of bodies hitting the ground, the scream of warnings, and the metallic click of the prison alarm. To control the spiraling violence, the California Department of Corrections began experimenting with new methods of containment. One of the most controversial solutions was the creation of secure housing units, SHUs, small, isolated cells designed to separate the most dangerous inmates from the general population. Folsom's own version of these high-security zones became a testing ground for the policy, and later, other prisons like Pelican Bay State Prison and Corcoran adopted similar systems. But isolation was a double-edged sword. While it reduced organized riots, it also fueled madness. Men spent years in total solitude, 23 hours a day in silence, with only the sound of their own heartbeat for company. Many broke down mentally, others became even more violent, crafting intricate communication systems to continue their gang operations through coded letters, smuggled notes, and secret signals. The 1970s and 1980s also saw the prison population explode. California's justice system, now driven by harsher sentencing laws, filled Folsom beyond capacity. The prison, designed for around 1,800 inmates, often held nearly twice that number. With limited food, poor medical care, and constant tension, Folsom turned into a pressure cooker. When it exploded, it was never small. One of the most notorious riots erupted in the late 1970s, when rival gangs clashed in the main yard over territory and drug control. The fight spread like wildfire. Guards fired warning shots, then real ones. When the smoke cleared, several inmates lay dead, dozens injured, and the yard was stained with blood. It was chaos on an industrial scale, proof that even with electric fences and armed towers, control was an illusion. Throughout the 1980s, the violence continued to ebb and flow. The introduction of narcotics inside the prison added another layer of volatility. Smuggled heroin and methamphetamines turned inmates desperate and unpredictable. Some gangs began using drugs as currency. Others used them as tools of manipulation. Control wasn't just about strength anymore, it was about who controlled the flow of contraband. The prison administration fought back with stricter lockdowns, random cell searches, and longer solitary confinements. Yet every new rule seemed to birth new forms of resistance. Riots broke out over living conditions, racial insults, or simple boredom. Inmates would set fires, flood cells, or refuse food, forcing guards into long, exhausting standoffs. Through it all, Folsom became more than a correctional facility. It became a legend of American punishment. Songs, films, and documentaries immortalized its name, often romanticizing its brutality. But the men who lived there knew the truth. There was nothing romantic about Folsom. The hardest lockdown in California was not just a phrase, it was a reality of constant fear and survival. By the end of the 1980s, California began shifting its attention towards supermax facilities, hoping to move its most dangerous inmates elsewhere. Still, the shadow of Folsom's violent past lingered. It was a place where the law met its limits, where human nature, cornered and enraged, revealed its darkest form. Folsom during this period was not merely a prison, it was a storm that never passed. Its walls were alive with whispers of alliances and betrayals, its cells stained by blood and regret. Inmates learned to speak softly, walk carefully, and trust no one. For decades, every sunrise brought the same unspoken question: who will survive today? As the 1990s dawned, a new chapter began for Folsom Prison, one caught between two identities. The world outside its walls was changing rapidly, moving toward rehabilitation, education, and reform, while Folsom itself struggled to shed its legacy of violence and despair. The old granite fortress, built in an age of chains and cruelty, now faced a modern question: could a prison so deeply scarred by blood ever truly change? Situated 20 miles northeast of Sacramento, Folsom Prison had long been California's symbol of fear. But by the late 20th century, the institution began to evolve into something more complex, a hybrid of discipline and reform. The state restructured it into two primary units: the main prison, which housed medium custody inmates, and the minimum support facility, designed for those serving lighter sentences and preparing for reintegration into society. This shift was not just administrative. It reflected a philosophical struggle between the old idea of punishment and the new ideal of rehabilitation. For decades, Folsom's reputation had been built on lockdowns, riots, and gang warfare. But now, the California Department of Corrections sought to introduce programs that aimed to educate rather than simply confine. Inmates were offered academic courses, vocational training, and career technical education, all intended to give them a second chance at life beyond the walls. For some, this meant learning to read or earn a GED. For others, it meant mastering trades like carpentry, plumbing, or auto repair. Slowly, small sparks of change began to flicker in a place long defined by darkness. However, the transformation wasn't easy. The same walls that had witnessed decades of violence were resistant to change. Many correctional officers, veterans of the bloodier years, remained skeptical. They had seen too much, lost too many friends, and buried too many illusions to believe that every man behind bars could be redeemed. For them, the prison's new programs were a noble idea in theory, but a dangerous risk in practice. Even among inmates, the shift toward rehabilitation was met with mixed emotions. Older prisoners, hardened by years of survival under gang dominance, viewed the reforms as naive. They understood Folsom's unwritten rules, the silent codes of respect and fear that had governed life for decades. Younger inmates, however, saw a glimmer of opportunity. For the first time, they could imagine leaving Folsom with something more than scars. They could leave with skills, education, and perhaps a future. Yet beneath this fragile surface of progress, violence still simmered. On August 27, 2010, Folsom erupted once again. During a riot involving nearly 200 inmates, guards were forced to open fire to restore control. The yard became chaos, men running, shouting, swinging makeshift weapons. 7 inmates were hospitalized, though miraculously none fatally injured. No guards were harmed, but the message was clear. Folsom's peace was always temporary. Even after more than a century, the old ghosts had not left. Just 2 years later, on September 19, 2012, violence struck again. A fight broke out shortly after 11 a.m. in one of the exercise yards. Within moments, the scene spiraled into another outbreak of chaos, shouts, sirens, and the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Guards used non-lethal force to regain control, but 1 inmate was shot, and at least 10 others suffered stab and slash wounds. The wounded were rushed to nearby hospitals, and Folsom returned to lockdown. It was as if history refused to let the prison move forward. Despite these setbacks, reformers continued to push for change. The new century brought with it a wave of restorative justice programs and mental health support. Chapels filled with men seeking faith. Classrooms filled with those chasing education. Inside Folsom, men began to find purpose in small acts of rebuilding, teaching literacy, mentoring younger inmates, or performing in the music and art programs that sought to humanize life behind bars. Ironically, the prison that once symbolized the harshest form of punishment began producing art, poetry, and even music that resonated beyond its walls. Decades earlier, Johnny Cash's legendary performance at Folsom in 1968 had already changed how the world viewed the inmates inside, showing that even the condemned still had a voice. In the modern era, that legacy continued as inmates used creativity to express pain, regret, and hope. Folsom, the place that once silenced men, was slowly beginning to listen. Still, the struggle for identity remained. Was Folsom a correctional facility or a rehabilitation center? Could it truly transform lives, or was it forever trapped by its past? The answer seemed to lie somewhere in between. The programs were making measurable differences: lower recidivism rates, better discipline, fewer infractions, but no one could ignore the unrelenting tension that defined daily life. Every classroom was built beside a cell block. Every lesson in hope was taught under watchtowers and barbed wire. Many former inmates who found success after their release credited Folsom's programs for giving them a second chance. Others described the prison as a paradox, a place that wanted to heal but couldn't stop bleeding. Even as California's justice system evolved, the sheer weight of Folsom's history made it impossible to erase its darker chapters. Guards, administrators, and inmates alike knew one truth: Folsom was not just another prison, it was an ecosystem. It thrived on balance. When that balance tipped, chaos would always follow. The 2010 and 2012 riots were proof that beneath any surface calm, the potential for violence was never far away. Generations of trauma had left their mark on the institution's very soul. Yet amid this reality there was also resilience. Inmates found faith in routines, strength in brotherhood, and meaning in progress. Some learned to read for the first time. Others earned college degrees through correspondence programs. The concept of redemption, once dismissed as a weakness, began to gain ground as one of Folsom's quiet revolutions. Modern Folsom stands today as a contradiction, a place where electric lights first burned in 1893, now illuminating classrooms, workshops, and counseling sessions. A place where execution chambers once claimed lives, now offering second chances to those who once had none. But even as education replaces fear and hope replaces hatred, the echoes of the past still drift through its corridors. The stone walls remain cold, the gates remain heavy, and the memories of violence still linger like shadows that refuse to fade. In every sense, modern Folsom embodies the tension between progress and punishment, between the desire to reform and the weight of history that resists it. It is both a monument to how far the prison system has come, and a reminder of how much further it must still go. Folsom Prison has long been a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of American crime. Within its granite walls, history was not just recorded, it was lived by some of the most dangerous, infamous, and complex figures ever to pass through the justice system. From cold-blooded serial killers to repentant writers, from gang leaders to entertainers who fell from grace, Folsom became a stage for humanity at its most extreme. Each name etched into its record tells a story of violence, notoriety, or redemption. Walking through its corridors even today, One can almost feel the presence of the men who once inhabited its cells, their footsteps echoing faintly through time. David Carpenter, the notorious trailside killer, stalked and murdered hikers across California in the late 1970s. Before his killing spree began, Carpenter spent time at Folsom for rape, robbery, and kidnapping. When he was finally captured, he revealed the chilling truth that some criminals are not reformed by confinement, they are shaped by it. Then there was Charles Ng, one half of the gruesome killing duo with Leonard Lake. Ng's name alone still chills even the most seasoned investigators. His stay at Folsom, while awaiting trial, symbolized a moment where the prison became not just a place of punishment, but a warehouse for evil so pure it defied comprehension. Angelo Buono Jr., better known as one of the Hillside Stranglers, also passed through Folsom's gates. Convicted of torturing and murdering young women in Los Angeles, Buono lived a life of twisted dominance. He even married inside Folsom's visiting room in 1986, a macabre image of romance behind bars, a reminder that even monsters seek connection. But Folsom's notoriety extended beyond serial killers. It was also a temporary home to figures from the underworld, politics, and pop culture. Sonny Barger, the legendary leader of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, once served time here. His presence brought the rebellious energy of the outlaw biker world into the prison, a world that shared Folsom's same code of loyalty, power, and defiance. In the shadows of the same cell blocks walked Eldridge Cleaver, a leading voice of the Black Panther Party. Once a revolutionary, Cleaver's time at Folsom reflected the complex intersection of politics, race, and punishment in America. While others sought escape, Cleaver sought transformation, writing, reflecting, and redefining himself through the very confinement that was meant to break him. One of the most fascinating figures to emerge from Folsom was Edward Bunker, an inmate who defied the stereotype of the irredeemable criminal. Bunker entered Folsom a violent offender but left a writer. His raw, unflinching novels about crime and prison life would later inspire Hollywood films, and he even appeared as an actor in Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs. Bunker's journey proved that even in Folsom, amid despair and brutality, the human mind could still find a way to create. Others were not as lucky. Thor Nis Christensen, a necrophilic serial killer from Santa Barbara, was murdered in Folsom's exercise yard in 1981, a grim justice served within the walls. The man who once hunted women on California's beaches met his end surrounded by the very violence he had inflicted on others. Charles Manson, perhaps the most infamous criminal of the 20th century, also spent time within Folsom's walls. His mere presence electrified the atmosphere. Manson was a manipulator, a cult leader who turned ordinary people into murderers. Inside Folsom, he became a symbol of absolute corruption. His name whispered by inmates, his legend growing even in isolation. Guards described his stare as unblinking, predatory, almost supernatural. To this day, his name lingers in Folsom's mythology like a ghost that refuses to leave. Eric Menendez, one of the brothers who brutally murdered their parents in Beverly Hills, also served part of his sentence here. His arrival marked a shift in Folsom's population, a new breed of inmate, rich, young, and media famous. The Menendez case blurred the lines between tragedy and spectacle, showing how even privilege couldn't protect one from the cold discipline of Folsom's regime. Among the notorious, there were also those wronged by the system. Craig Coley, convicted of a double murder in 1978, spent nearly 40 years in prison before being pardoned and exonerated by Governor Jerry Brown in 2017. DNA evidence proved his innocence. His decades at Folsom stand as a haunting reminder that even the most secure institutions are capable of devastating mistakes. Behind Folsom's walls, guilt and innocence sometimes shared the same cell block. Not every Folsom story was about crime and punishment, some were about redemption and transformation. Danny Trejo, now a celebrated Hollywood actor, once served time at Folsom during his troubled youth. He entered the prison a violent drug addict and left a man determined to change. Today, his name represents one of the most remarkable turnarounds in entertainment history. Trejo himself often speaks of how the brutal honesty of prison life forced him to confront himself, to choose between destruction and rebirth. Folsom also hosted figures from the arts and politics who added to its bizarre legacy. Timothy Leary, the controversial psychologist and LSD advocate, served time there for drug offenses, while Rick James, the legendary funk musician, spent 2 years behind those walls in the 1990s. For Leary, prison was another stage in his war against conformity. For James, it was the end of a spiral that fame and addiction had created. And then there was Glenn Stewart Godwin, a man whose name would become synonymous with daring. Godwin's escape from Folsom remains one of the most legendary in modern prison history, earning him a spot on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. His breakout, meticulously planned and executed, cemented Folsom's reputation not just as a prison of confinement, but as a place where even the impossible could happen. Together, these names, Manson, Ng, Cleaver, Trejo, Carpenter, Buono, Bunker, form a mosaic of the human condition at its extremes. They represent rage, madness, intelligence, rebellion, and even redemption. In their stories, we see the many faces of crime and the many consequences of confinement. To walk through Folsom's archives is to walk through the dark history of American justice itself. The prison has seen the rise and fall of entire criminal empires, the death of murderers, the rebirth of the lost, and the condemnation of the innocent. Each inmate added a new layer to the legend, a legend of power, punishment, and perseverance. The walls of Folsom have contained the worst of humanity, but they've also revealed something unexpected. That even in a place built for despair, there exists a strange kind of hope. The hope that even the most broken souls can still find a fragment of meaning before their time runs out. As the sun sets behind the Sierra Nevada hills, the shadow of Folsom Prison stretches long and cold across the California landscape. Its walls stand firm, etched with the whispers of men who lived, suffered, and sometimes redeemed themselves within its bounds. Folsom isn't just a prison. It's a mirror reflecting both the darkness and the resilience of the human soul. From Johnny Cash's haunting performance that gave a voice to the forgotten, to the infamous inmates whose stories read like twisted legends, Folsom remains a timeless reminder that justice and humanity often share uneasy ground. Inside its stone corridors, lives were destroyed, others rebuilt, and a few reborn. Every cell tells a story, of guilt, of regret, of hope clawing its way through despair. And though decades have passed, the echoes of chains, the cries of defiance, and the soft prayers of redemption still linger in the air, like ghosts unwilling to leave. Because Folsom Prison was never just a place of punishment. It was, and still is, a lesson, etched in steel and sorrow, about what it truly means to be human. Even now, when the night falls silent over those ancient walls, you can almost hear the faint echo of Johnny Cash's voice rising from the past. I hear the train a-comin', it's rollin' round the bend. And with that, Folsom's story lives on, forever caught between sin and salvation. Locomotive.